Okay, we are in week 4 of the book of Revelation, Prophecy of Doom or Message of Hope. And of course, if you have been here before, and most of you have been here before, you know that I think that the book of Revelation is actually a message of hope, even though it's often portrayed as this prophecy of doom. But we have spent 3 weeks already on the book of Revelation, and the very fact that you have come back is an indication that you're not yet overwhelmed by everything we've done, but this is confusing material. So I'm going to do a little bit more review just to get us up to speed, but I really want to focus on chapters 12 and 13 today and try and get into chapter 14 as well. So let's see if we can't begin by sort of stating what the title is of this session. This is called The Woman, the Dragon, and the Beasts. Again, focusing on chapters 12 and 13, but hopefully we can get through chapter 14 as well and then into the beginning of chapter 15. So, an outline of chapters 1 through 5. Just to review this, we've gone over this though before. Chapter 1 has both the introduction of John, the prologue, the introduction and call of John. Chapters 2 and 3 have those 7 letters to the 7 churches that we looked at a couple of weeks ago. Chapters 4 and 5 describe the heavenly court. Chapter 4 in particular deals with God the Father on a throne. And then the Lamb is introduced in the sealed scroll in chapter 5. So to go to that chapter 5 passage, we learn in that passage at the beginning of chapter 5 that the one seated on the throne has a scroll written on the inside and on the back sealed with 7 seals. And I've stated now a couple of times that that scroll written on the inside and on the back sealed with 7 seals, is going to be explained in chapters 6 through 11. 6 through 11. And we're going to see that it's going to be unsealed. Those 7 seals are going to be unsealed. And when they are unsealed, let's see if I can show you this. We are going to be introduced to what are vision cycles in the book of Revelation. In fact, this section from chapter 6 through chapter 11 consists of 2 vision cycles. But there are multiple vision cycles in the book of Revelation, starting in chapter 1, extending all the way into chapter 21. And each of those vision cycles has 7 elements. 7 elements. Sometimes, as in the case of the trumpets and of the seals, those elements are numbered. So you have the first seal, the second seal, the first trumpet, the second trumpet. In other cases, those 7 elements are not numbered. And the ones we're going to deal with today are not numbered. The ones starting in chapter 12. That cycle is not numbered. So I'll identify the numbers for you as we go along there. But the point that's important to point out is that these vision cycles recapitulate repeatedly the entire drama of salvation. They begin with persecution and suffering. They move to judgment, particularly judgment of those who persecute and create the suffering. And then finally, the triumph of God. And because I love this little graphic here, I've showed you this on several occasions already. You see that these 3 elements, beginning with persecution and suffering, move into judgment of those who persecute, and then from there, the triumph of God. And just when you think that vision cycle is complete, we're going to start again. And we're going to go over and over and over these cycles. We're going to recapitulate the entire drama of salvation multiple times. We also saw in last week's class that the structure of at least the first 2 cycles, the structure of those, in fact, expresses apocalyptic expectation. And what I mean by that is that you see when you look at the opening of the seals are opened in chapter 6 and 7, chapter 6, all of them are opened in chapter 6. They're opened in rather rapid order, 6:1, 6:3, 6:5, 6:7, 6:9, 6:12. And just when you would expect the seventh one to be opened, it's not. In other words, there is a delay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, where you expect the seventh to happen, it doesn't occur. There's a delay. And that's what expresses the apocalyptic expectation. There's this great anticipation of the end that's going to happen at any moment, and yet it doesn't happen. There's a pause, there is a delay. And as a result, there is this interlude that you have. In this case, it's all of chapter 7 before you get to the opening of the seventh seal at the beginning of chapter 8. We're going to see in the opening of the seventh seal, the triumph of God, where there is silence in heaven for about half an hour in 8:1. But just when you think it's over, this one cycle is over, it's not over. Now we're going to be introduced to those 7 trumpets, those 7 horns. And they're going to be sounded also as the seals were unsealed in rapid order. So the first trumpet is going to be sounded in 8:7, then 8:8, then 8:10, then 8:12, then 9:1, 9:13. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in relatively rapid and regular succession. And just when you expect the seventh, there's going to be a delay. Another pause, another interlude. This time a chapter and a half from 10:1 to 11:14 before you have the seventh trumpet sounded in 11:15. This interlude is particularly important. This interlude is particularly important because in that interlude, we're introduced to a second scroll. In contrast to the first scroll in chapter 5, the scroll in chapter 10 now is going to be the subject of the second half of the book of Revelation. So the scroll that we're going to be introduced in that interlude in chapter 10, I saw another mighty angel coming down from heaven wrapped in a cloud with a rainbow over his head. His face was like the sun and his legs like pillars of fire. He held a little scroll open in his hand. That little scroll that is open is going to be the subject of chapters 12 through 21. And we're going to find out that John is going to take that scroll and ingest it. The voice that I heard from heaven spoke to me again, saying, "Go, take the scroll that's open in the hand of the angel who's standing on the sea and on the land." I went to the angel and told him, "Give it to me." He said, "Take and eat. It will be bitter to your stomach, but sweet as honey in your mouth." And so that's exactly what John does. He eats the scroll, and by ingesting the words of God, he's now supposed to prophesy again. What he speaks now is going to be God's words. You must prophesy again, and that prophecy again is the second half of the book of Revelation. The fact that this is a smaller scroll means that what you're going to get in this part of the book of Revelation is going to be more detailed. It's going to be more detailed than that first scroll and what was on the first scroll. So the seventh trumpet is sounded. The seventh trumpet in 11:15 is sounded. There were loud voices in heaven saying, "The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever." I told you that's a part of the Hallelujah chorus of Handel's Messiah. 11:15 is going to end up introducing to us the triumph of God. The 24 elders who sit on their thrones before God fell on their faces and worshiped God, singing, "We give thanks, Lord God Almighty, who are and who were, for you've taken your great power and begun to reign. The nations raged, but your wrath has come, and the time for judging the dead, for rewarding your servants, the prophets and saints, and all who fear your name, both small and great, and for destroying those who destroy the earth." So here we have the triumph of God described for a second time. This is at the end of the second cycle, the cycle dealing with the sounding of the trumpets. And that brings us now to the beginning of chapter 12. And chapter 12 is going to begin a new cycle. a new cycle of visions. This, though, is an unnumbered cycle of visions. And the contents, as I indicated before, of this scroll, this little scroll, will be starting in chapter 12, but extend all the way into chapter 21. So let's look at the beginning of this. And again, I'm going to number these for, okay. I don't want to do that. Again, I'll number these for you as we go through it because these are unnumbered visions. But I want to pull back for just a moment because, again, a point that I've made repeatedly is in our time together is that I don't want to get caught up in the trees. I want you to see the forest. I want you to see that even though all of the particulars are not completely understood, the main question of the book of Revelation is something you can grasp. And that's what I want to look at just briefly. I want you to recognize that the central theological question in the book of Revelation is actually quite simple. The answer that Revelation gives, although it's quite detailed and seems to be quite complex, is actually simple as well. But the central theological question that the book of Revelation raises is who's in charge? Who's in charge of the world that we live in today? Is it Satan and the forces of evil, or does God reign supreme? And that question is asked, as I've said before, that question is asked in the midst of Christian suffering and Christians actually dying for the faith that they proclaim. They don't understand how. They don't understand how being faithful to God results in their death. And as a result, it looks like Satan is winning the current battle. So the question is, who will win the war? Will Satan or will God? That is the central theological question that the book of Revelation is wrestling with. And it's wrestling with that issue because of its present historical situation in the context of suffering. The suffering of those who are first hearing this book read, or first hearing this book, read. It would have been read. The answer to that question that the book of Revelation gives is related to what we've talked about before, and that is the three-tiered universe. Remember, the ancients had this view that there were three tiers, that existence in the world today is lived on three tiers. It is on earth, which was considered to be flat, or in heaven above, or in the underworld below. That is the three-tiered universe that was a part of the worldview of the ancients. And so Revelation's understanding of the three-tiered universe and the ultimate victory of God is related to that three-tiered universe, because God's victory is ultimately going to come in three stages related to the three-tiered universe. So I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Let's talk about these unnumbered visions. Here are the numbers for the unnumbered visions that we have. The woman and the beast, or the woman and the dragon, is going to be the subject of chapter 12, which you'll want to spend some time looking at carefully. The first beast is going to be introduced in the very end of chapter 12 and then into 13. And then the second beast is also going to be talked about in the second half of chapter 13. Followed then by four more visions, the Lamb and the 144,000 in Revelation 14, the first part of Revelation 14, the three angels and their prophecies in chapter 14:6 following, the day of judgment in chapter 14:14, and then the triumph of God at the beginning of chapter 15. Here you're going to have suffering again here in those first four. Then you're going to have judgment in the 5 and 6 phase here, and then the triumph of God in chapter 7. But as I say, these are not numbered in the text, and it's easy sort of to get lost. So I'll try and keep these numbers here as we look at each of those elements. And that's what I want to focus on today. I want to focus on this particular set of unnumbered visions, this vision cycle. And it begins in chapter 12, verse 1. The woman and the dragon. This is the first of the visions. And I want you to help me figure out who these characters are. So it begins like this. A great portent appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pangs in the agony of giving birth. Then another portent appeared in heaven, a great red dragon, with 7 heads and 7 horns and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. So even though you may not know who these characters are at the present time, you can tell that the woman is a good person, a good figure. She's clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet. She's one who is supported by creation itself. Whereas the great red dragon is exactly the opposite. He is an agent of destruction, an agent of chaos. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. So the woman is good, the red dragon is bad. Who is the woman who is talked about here? Well, when I ask my students this, because she was pregnant and crying out with birth pangs and the agony of giving birth, my students end up saying that this is Mary. That's actually not right, but it's a good guess. The key here is that on her head was a crown of 12 stars. Actually, the woman is Israel. The 12 stars represent the 12 tribes of Israel. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pangs in the agony of giving birth, and another portent appeared in heaven, a great red dragon. Who is this great red dragon, and what is his relationship to the woman? Well, we keep reading. Then the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bear a child, so that he might devour her child as soon as it was born. And she gave birth to a son, a male child who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. So Israel is to give birth to the Messiah. But her child was snatched away and taken to God and to his throne, and the woman fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared by God so that there she can be nourished for 1,260 days. So this dragon and the woman are opposed to one another. The dragon wants to snatch the child that the woman is going to give birth to. But the male child is snatched away and taken to God and to his throne. Being snatched away and taken to his throne is not a reference to Jesus' birth, but in fact to the ascension, the resurrection, and the ascension of Jesus. So in giving birth, in bringing the Messiah into the world, Israel has done its part. Then God is going to snatch the child away, is going to raise Jesus from the dead, and he's going to ascend into heaven. So again, the dragon can't get to him. So we keep reading once Jesus arrives in heaven. And here I am reminded always of my life as a child. I used to love to watch Saturday afternoon Westerns. And in my day, which my students have no understanding of, in my day, that was great entertainment on a Saturday afternoon. They ran all of these really bad B Westerns that I used to love to watch. In every one of those Westerns, there is always a scene where the bad guy and the good guy come together, normally on the main street of the town. And one of them says to the other, "This town ain't big enough for the both of us." And so they have to have a gunfight and someone dies. Usually it's the bad guy. Well, that's really what happens when Jesus is taken to heaven. Because when he ascends to heaven, we find out that war breaks out in heaven. The forces of evil and his angels fight against the dragon. So when Jesus ascends to heaven, war breaks out in heaven because heaven's not big enough for both Jesus and the dragon. So the forces of good, Michael and his killer angels, fight against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but they were defeated. and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. The great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. So Satan loses. Satan loses the war that was fought, or the battle that was fought in heaven. He's ejected from heaven and thrown down on earth. So there is great celebration then in heaven as a result of Satan's defeat. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven proclaiming, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah, for the accuser of our comrades has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. But they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they did not cling to life, even in the face of death." So Satan has been thrown down, and heaven is thrilled that, in fact, Satan has been defeated. He who is the accuser of our comrades. This notion of Satan as being an accuser goes back to the book of Job. And if you're familiar with the story of Job chapters 1 and 2, the Satan figure, and there Satan is not a personal name, it's a title. The Satan is an accuser. He is sort of a prosecuting attorney that appears before God to tell God to accuse God of people on earth. So in fact, he plays on God's team in the book of Job. And that's why he is in heaven, according to the book of Revelation. But he has, in fact, now become a hindrance, not a help. And so he's going to oppose what happens in heaven. And as a result, he's going to be thrown out of heaven. Notice, though, when there's celebration in heaven, there is now woe on earth. "Rejoice then, you heavens, and those who dwell in them, but woe to the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you with great wrath, because he knows that his time is short." Like a wounded animal, Satan is incredibly mean now in his new home on earth. He knows that his days are short, he has nothing to lose, and so he pulls out all the stops and is even meaner than he was when he was in heaven. So woe to the earth and the sea. While heavens are rejoicing, woe to the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you with great wrath. So here is a little diagram about what we have seen so far. It begins again with our three-tiered universe, and we have Christ ascending after his death and resurrection. Christ is going to ascend to heaven. When Christ ascends to heaven, war is going to break out in heaven. That's going to result in the defeat of Satan, who is then going to be thrown down to earth. So heaven has been cleaned out. Heaven now is rid of Satan and the forces of evil. The problem is now Satan and the forces of evil are on earth. And Satan and the forces of evil, knowing that their days are numbered, are particularly deadly. So Satan on earth, what is Satan going to do when Satan gets on earth? Well, he's really angry. He's angry at what the woman has done. So the dragon, when he saw that he'd been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who'd given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the two wings of the great eagle so that she could fly from the serpent into the wilderness to her place where she's nourished for a time and times and half a time. Then from his mouth the serpent poured water like a river after the woman to sweep her away with the flood, but the earth came to the help of the woman. It opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from its mouth. This is, again, one of these passages that it is helpful to understand the historical setting. The reference to two wings of the great eagle that have been given to the woman so that she could avoid the serpent is a reference to Rome. Rome's symbol was the eagle with spread wings to show the extent of the Roman Empire, but also to show the power of the Roman Empire. The eagle, this majestic figure who is powerful and feared, was the symbol of Rome. And in the Roman Empire, I've talked about this before, in the Roman Empire, Judaism was understood as a legitimate religion. Jews were allowed to practice their faith unimpeded as long as they didn't rebel. Of course, they rebelled in 66 to 70, but generally speaking, Jews were allowed to practice their religion in the Roman Empire. So that's why they were protected by the two wings of the great eagle. So Satan can't get at the woman, that is Israel, because of the protection that Israel enjoys in the Roman Empire. So now the dragon is even angrier. He can't get at the woman who gave birth to the Messiah. So what's he going to do? Then the dragon was angry with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her children, those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. In other words, because Satan could not attack Israel, Satan goes after those whom he can attack, and those are the children of Israel, who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus, which is a description of Christians. As I said before, Christianity was not a legitimate religion in the Roman Empire, so they were vulnerable to persecution in the latter decades of the first century when the book of Revelation was written. So now the dragon is singling out for persecution the children of Israel that she can, in fact, access, and those happen to be Christians. So in answer to the question of who is in charge, a question that's asked in the midst of suffering of Christians, does the suffering of Christians mean that God is not in control? On the contrary, says the book of Revelation. The suffering of Christians proves that God is in control. And the reason that Christians have been singled out is that Satan knows that he's doomed. Satan knows that his days are numbered. And so what he has done is, with great viciousness, he's gone after Christians. And that persecution is an indication that ultimately Satan is doomed. He knows that his days are numbered. So persecution shouldn't call into question the faith of Christians. In fact, it should confirm the faith of Christians. Well, that brings us to the second vision that is going to be introduced at the end of chapter 12 and then on into chapter 13 of the first beast. The first beast. And this is now another important image that you need to understand in the book of Revelation. Then the dragon took his stand on the sand of the seashore, and I saw a beast rising out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads. And on its horns were 10 diadems, and on its heads were blasphemous names. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And the dragon gave it his power and his throne and great authority. One of its heads seemed to have received a death blow, but its mortal wound had been healed. In amazement, the whole earth followed the beast. They worshiped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it?" Okay, again, you need to know some historical information here to understand the image. A beast rising out of the sea. What you need to be aware of is that Rome was known for its naval might. Rome's navy was feared throughout the ancient world. And so a beast rising out of the sea is a reference to the Roman Empire. And that's confirmed by the reference to the 7 heads that it has. If you're familiar with Rome, there are the 7 hills of Rome. So a beast rising out of the sea with 7 heads, that is a reference to Rome. And notice what happens. The dragon, this is Satan, gave that beast rising out of the sea his power and his throne and great authority. So who is now doing the will of the dragon on earth? Rome. Rome is the front person for Satan. So everyone on earth, the whole earth, followed the beast. They worshiped the dragon, Satan, for he'd given his authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like the beast and who can fight against it? Rome now has taken the position of the front person for Satan and the forces of evil. And so Roman persecution of Christians is the way that Satan is accessing Christians and causing them great harm. Rome is the beast, the first beast. That brings us to another passage about the beast. The beast was given a mouth, uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. And it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. It was given authority over every tribe and people and language and nation, and all the inhabitants of the earth will worship it, everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb that was slaughtered. Notice it was allowed to make war on the saints. And I think I've told you before that the term saints in the New Testament does not mean simply people who are incredibly holy. Saints is a synonym for believers, Christian believers. It was allowed to make war on Christians and to conquer them. So God is allowing this to take place. This is all a part of God's plan. He's allowing the beast to exercise authority for a time, a limited time. And that authority is going to result in the death of some saints who are going to, in fact, conquer the beast by giving their lives up in obedience to God. Everyone else in the world, however, is going to worship the beast. And all of the inhabitants of the earth are going to be caught up in worship of the beast. All those whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb. That brings us then to this one exhortation in the book of Revelation, a very important exhortation that shows how you keep. Remember, we talked about how Martin Luther, at the very beginning of our sessions, Martin Luther claimed that the book of Revelation reveals nothing, and he, in fact, didn't understand how you were supposed to keep the book of Revelation. Well, here is an exhortation. This is what it's really all about, what you're supposed to do with this book. Let anyone who has an ear listen. If you're captive, if you are to be taken captive, into captivity you go. If you kill with the sword you must be killed. Here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. In these present circumstances, how do you keep the book of Revelation? You remain faithful. You endure what you are to endure, what is in front of you. You remain faithful in all circumstances. That's how you keep the book of Revelation. And that's ultimately what the book of Revelation is about. It's looking into the future in order to motivate believers to endure their present circumstances. It looks into the future to encourage and to embolden people to endure in their present circumstances. That's a vitally important thing to understand about Revelation and about prophetic literature in general. You look to the future to motivate people at the present time. That brings us then to the second half of chapter 13, which is the introduction of another beast. Then I saw another beast that rose out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast on its behalf, and it makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound had been healed. It performed great signs, and by the signs that it was allowed to perform on behalf of the beast, it deceives the inhabitants of the earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that had been wounded by the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast could even speak and cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. Now, let me go back to the beginning of that passage and simply point out the description of this beast is that it has two horns like a lamb. And we know a lamb is a good person or a good figure, and it spoke like a dragon, which we know is an evil figure. So here we have someone that looks like a lamb but speaks like a dragon. This is a description of the Antichrist, one who looks like the Christ, but who in fact is opposed to everything that Jesus is about, the Antichrist. Now, I want to make it clear that that language, Antichrist, is not used in the book of Revelation. That is a term actually that comes from elsewhere in the New Testament, but it's not a part of the book of Revelation, but that's the figure that is going to oppose God's will on earth, that we would label the Antichrist figure. And he is the one that is going to exercise authority of the first beast. It exercises all the authority of the first beast on its behalf. And that has led people to believe that what is being described is one of the Roman Caesars. One of the Roman Caesars. It would be one who is exercising authority of the first beast, the Roman Empire. So the second beast is a Roman ruler. If you keep reading, this is a very, very familiar passage, or one that you may have heard before. Also, it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell who does not have the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a person. Its number is 666. There is a footnote on that. There is a little G here in my text, and that footnote indicates that other ancient authorities read 616, 616. But most ancient authorities read 666. And so you've heard this number of the beast, and I like to tell my students the story, although I'm not proud of it, of the time when we lived in Gettysburg many years ago, and I was up late at night grading papers, I think, and so I decided to take a study break, and the giant grocery store was not too far from our house, so I drove to the giant grocery store and I loaded up with all those late night essentials like Cheetos and Diet Coke and maybe I had some Fritos and some things like that. Pretzels, I love pretzels, and maybe pretzels or popcorn or something like. And I'm taking all of this stuff. I go to check out, put it on the conveyor belt, and the young woman who is there, this was before we had sort of individual self-checkout, the young woman who was scanning all of my items just really startled me. I was in a daze sort of thinking about grading, and she jumped. And it just so startled me. And she looked at me and she said, "Look." And with that, she pointed to the cash register and to the total of my purchase, which was $6.66. And she said, "I could not possibly charge you $6.66. You know what 666 means." And I thought to myself, I sure do. It means that I spent a lot of money on junk food that I really didn't need and probably shouldn't have bought. But she said, "You know what that means." And I thought to myself, well, I'm glad you know, because I really don't know. 666 is the number of the beast, and it's the name of someone. So let me show you what is being talked about here, by giving you a crash course in Hebrew and in Greek. In antiquity, Hebrew letters and Greek letters had both a letter value, but also a numerical value. That's the same way that Latin had. So we have Roman numerals. We have letters that function as numbers in the Roman numeral system. And that's true both in Hebrew and in Greek. So you have all of the letters, the consonants in the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, Beth, Gimel, Dalet, He, Waw, Zayin, Het, Thet, Yod, all of those have a certain numerical value. And similarly, all of the letters of the Greek alphabet have numerical value as well. All of these have numerical value, with the result that everyone's name could be totaled up. You could have a special number that would be associated with your name simply by totaling up the letters, the numerical value of the letters of your name. So when it says 666 is the name or the number of the beast, and that represents a name, you can just imagine how many different configurations could add up to 666. So there are a number of theories of who 666 was. 666 was probably understood very, very clearly to people in the community, the communities that this was addressed to. But we don't really know the identity of 666. This is one of the details that we simply don't know. There are a lot of theories about it, and I'll give you a couple of theories. One is that it is the sum of the first letters, the sum of the first letters of the names of all of the Roman Caesars from Augustus through Domitian. And Domitian would have been the Roman ruler at the time of the book of Revelation. So the first letters of the names of the Roman Caesars from Augustus through Domitian adds up to 666. Another popular theory is that the sum of the letters of Nero's name and title, but this time it's in Hebrew, adds up to 666 as well. So it could be that it is generally a Roman ruler, in this case, or very specifically Nero, who is being talked about as the 666 figure. Nero was understood in the ancient world to be evil incarnate. He was the equivalent of a modern day Hitler, evil incarnate. And so it's a Nero-like figure who is the Antichrist, according to that theory. But I want to show you something else. Here's another theory that I think is sort of interesting, and that is if you look at the name of Jesus, the name of Jesus in Greek is Jesus, and if you look at the numerical value of those letters, it begins with iota, and iota is worth 10, goes to eta, eta is worth 8, a sigma is worth 200, an omicron is worth 70, an upsilon is worth 400, and another sigma is worth 200. If you add all of those numbers up, you get 888. So 666 could simply be a bastardization of the name of Jesus. It could, in fact, be, as Jesus is so significant, you have a deficient 666 as the Antichrist figure. 666, 6 is also the number of evil in Hebrew. 7 is the number of completion. So 6 is seen to be a number that is less than complete, less than perfect, therefore imperfect. So imperfection upon imperfection upon imperfection may also be what 666 represents. The simple fact of the matter is we do not know explicitly and without any doubt who that 666 figure is referred to in the book of Revelation. Okay, we can come back if you've got more questions about that. I can deal a little bit more with that, but let's try and get through the rest of this particular cycle. We have a few more scenes to look at. One is the Lamb and the 144,000. So after we have the two beasts introduced, the woman and the dragon, and then the two beasts in chapter 13, we're going to jump to chapter 14, and we're going to look, and there was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him were 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. Remember, these 144,000 are marked. They are marked with the sign of the Lamb. I heard a voice from heaven like the sound of many waters, the sound of loud thunder. The voice I heard was the sound of harpists playing on their harps. They sing a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and before the elders. No one could learn that song except the 144,000 who've been redeemed from the earth. It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. These follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They've been redeemed from humankind as first fruits for God and the Lamb, and in their mouth no lie was found. They are blameless. So here we have a view of those persons who have, in fact, died for the faith. So here, this is, on the one hand, it's sort of pointing toward the ultimate victory of God, but their presence in heaven is because they've been redeemed from the earth, and they've been redeemed through their deaths for the faith. They're the first fruits that have been taken up from God, who appear before God and the Lamb. So we have that reference. We've seen that a little bit earlier in the book of Revelation. We now are looking at this again, the Lamb and the 144,000. The next vision are three messages that we're going to get that are going to talk about judgment. So we've moved out of persecution into the judgment phase here of the cycle. Then I saw an angel flying in mid-heaven with an eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on earth, to every tribe and to every nation and tribe and language and people. He said in a loud voice, "Fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and springs of water." Judgment day has arrived. You better worship him who made heaven and earth and the springs of water. A second message, another angel, a second followed, saying, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication." Here is again judgment against Babylon. And we're going to see, and I will talk about this more extensively next week, that Babylon is a code name for Rome. So here is a foreshadowing of Rome's demise in the second message. And then finally, a third angel follows them, crying with a loud voice, "Those who worship the beast and its image and receive a mark on their foreheads and on their hands, they will also drink the wine of God's wrath, poured unmixed into the cup of his anger. And they will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb." So here again is judgment. Three different messages that talk about judging those who oppose God and God's people. From there, we're going to have another image of judgment, and that is reaping the earth's harvest. This is often a symbol for judgment, is reaping, which is a violent act of cutting down the wheat and the other grain that you have in a field. Then I looked, and there was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like a son of man, with a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to the one who sat on the cloud, "Use your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is fully ripe." So the one who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. All of this judgment now is going to result in the triumph of God. And that is the last of the 7 scenes that we have in this vision cycle. And I saw what appeared to be a sea of glass mixed with fire, and those who had conquered the beast and its image and the number of its name standing beside the sea of glass with harps of God in their hands. And they sang the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb. Great and amazing are your deeds, Lord God the Almighty. Just and true are your ways, King of the nations, Lord, who will not fear and glorify your name. For you alone are holy. All nations will come and worship before you, for your judgments have been revealed. So here, all these people who have conquered the beast and its image and the number of its name, standing beside the glass of the sea of glass with harps in their hand, and all of them are praising God. Again, all of heaven is breaking out into praise of God. And that brings us to the end of session 4. So what we look forward to next week is session 5. Conveniently, well named session 5 after session 4. We're going to talk about bowled over in Babylon. And this is going to be a consideration of Revelation 15 through the beginning of chapter 19. This is about the destruction of Babylon, which is Rome, as I've indicated. I'll talk more about that, though, next time. And that is the subject of what we're going to be doing in our next class. But all of that is for next week. I'll see if there are questions that people have. Did anyone, I don't want to go there. Does anyone have any questions? Did we have anyone that shared any questions or anything else? Let me go back and see if
yeah, feel free to unmute and ask a question, anybody.
Okay, is anyone asking a question? I'm not hearing any questions. You're still awake? Okay, well that's good. That's a good sign. That is really important material, friends. That's something to go back and read over again, particularly chapters 12 and 13. That's really important to understand because you'll see that's the first phase of God's victory, and it explains why Christians are suffering so much at the present time.
Did Nero live in the time of Revelation when it was?
No, Nero died in 68.
Okay,
He
so
committed.
he would have been known.
He was known. It was Nero, and I'll talk a little bit about this next week. There were all kinds of theories. Do you know how the theory, there is the belief, and it goes all the way back to antiquity, that there are some people that are so evil that they can't die. You know, the stories about Hitler. Hitler didn't commit suicide. Hitler escaped and lived in Argentina until he was an old man, and that kind of stuff. It's that same view of Nero. He was supposed to have committed suicide in 68, but there were still people that believed he was just too darn mean to ever die. And he was going to come back, and he was going to, in fact, organize people and bring them against God and the forces of good in the world. And that's what you're seeing here. It's either Nero sort of reincarnated or a Nero-like figure who's going to be the one that will sort of lead the charge against God's people, moving toward what is known as the Battle of Armageddon, which is the subject of next week.
Why did they use the word Michael? Michael and the dragon.
Oh, Michael is the head of angels.
Oh,
he is the archangel. He's an archangel. Okay. He is top dog in the angel world.
Okay.
So Michael is Michael is the head of angels, of God's angels, and he is a killer angel. These are warrior angels. They're not little figurine kinds of people. These are warrior angels. And Michael is the head of them. So when he gathers his forces, he's the general that leads them into battle.
We
Well,
sort of
my-
asked this, whoops, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
We sort of asked this question last week, but I want to ask it again. Why all the symbolism?
Well, I'll talk more specifically about that next week as we talk about
Okay.
sort of this code language for Rome. But when you are living in a repressive regime like Rome, you've got to be really careful what you say about the government. You just don't have freedom of speech in that kind of repressive regime. And Christians were very, very aware of flying above the radar. When they flew above the radar and made too much of a stink, they were on the radar screen of Rome. And because they were an illegitimate religion, they became vulnerable to persecution. It was much better to fly under the radar and to use language that would not be understood by the Roman authorities. And that way they could survive. So it was a survival mechanism for them. And one of the reasons why you can't take this out of its historical context. It's really important to understand this in its ancient historical context.
Right.
I thought it was interesting how Revelations is saying those who die, they will be rewarded. They will bear the fruit. And it reminds me of so many like jihadists. They are promised many things when they die. Is this just the normal, something that people think when they're going?
Well, that's a fascinating point, but I will point out, and I think it is important to understand that Islam is built on Judaism and Christianity.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of jihad, the word jihad comes from the Hebrew word harem. And harem is what was done when the Israelites took over Jericho and the Promised Land. They were supposed to devote everything to God. They were supposed to kill everything, all animals and all livestock. They were supposed to kill all people. They were supposed to take nothing for themselves. That's a part of the Hebrew Bible that ends up getting picked up in Islam. And that kind of all-consuming crusade against the infidel, in fact, is grounded in the Hebrew Bible. Now, Jews no longer practice that, and they would distance themselves from that practice altogether and recognize that that was done in antiquity and has no modern application. But that ends up influencing Islam. And the idea of martyrdom, which became very important in Christianity, is another thing that ends up influencing Islam. So they get these ideas from these two previous conditions. Christianity, remember, was around for 600 years before Islam ever arrived. And it was around, and Judaism was around thousands of years before Islam.
Thank you.
Other questions or reactions? It's what a great way to spend a beautiful Sunday morning, right?
Absolutely.
Talking about jihad and again, I want to emphasize how important it is if you are facing death for the faith. You really want to be assured that your death counts for something. And that's really what the book of Revelation, I think, is trying to say. If you die for the faith, it does count for something, and you, in fact, will be rewarded. So don't give up. Don't recant. Don't cave in when you are faced with persecution. Be obedient unto death. As Jesus was obedient unto death, that's what we are called to be as well in the face of persecution. And if you do, according to the book of Revelation, yes, you will be rewarded. There will be special treatment that you will receive. But it's not saying go out and kill other people, which is, again, sort of what the jihadist is. This is about personal death. This is giving oneself up to the cause. It's not taking out innocent people. It's when you are being persecuted yourself, not resisting, and being faithful to your faith, even in the face of persecution.
Anybody else? Thank you so much, Buzz. We're a little bit over time. Appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate all of your faithful participation here. As I say, I know this is tough stuff. I'm really, really appreciative, though, that you're willing to slug through this with me. So come back next week. We've got 2 more weeks. Next week, we're going to talk about the fall of Rome and the horror of WHORE of Babylon. And then the following week, we'll talk about the other phases of God's overcoming of evil, phase 2 and 3. Okay? Have a great week, everyone. Think about me as I head back to campus and have no idea what I'm doing this coming week, but keep me in your thoughts and prayers. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Buzz. Bye, everybody.
Okay, bye-bye.